Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the webinar. We have two presentations on evaluating your whole farm resources, and those are going to be by Jen Werlin with University of Idaho Extension in Teton County, so she's joining us from Driggs, and Jennifer Jensen with U of I Extension in Bonner County up in Sandpoint. So we have people joining from across both ends of Idaho. So I want to go ahead and give Jen just a second to get ready to share her screen. So there we go, Jen. If you want to share your slides, Jennifer Jensen. Great. We see your slides, and I'll hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Colette. And we are going to have Jen Werlin start off this presentation on evaluating your whole farm resources.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. I think I'm like juggling different computers right now, so this will be good. As long as you can hear me. Okay, Jensen. With all the Jens, we need to have Gen 1, Gen 2. Okay. Jen Jensen. Okay, good, we're on the right slide. Okay, so when you're evaluating your whole farm resources, there are a lot of considerations that you need to make. And these include human resources, financial resources, natural resources, physical resources, mapping your property, different types of rules and regulations, what type of markets are out there, and then community resources. To define a little bit about these resources, human resources include things like labor. So determine if you need some on-site accommodations, how much labor you may need, and the associated costs with the labor. And then even if you can get work-share volunteers, like for a CSA, that's a labor resource. In terms of natural resources, those include soil, water, irrigation, topography, and climate. In terms of physical resources, those include buildings, sheds, if you have hoop houses or greenhouses, also access to power, phone, and internet, roads, and other services. So, and it's also important for you to consider nearby agriculture or industry adjacent to your property. In terms of mapping your property, you need to it's great to get an overview of your land and the surrounding resources so you can actually measure out dimensions. This will help you as when you start to determine what type of enterprises you'll be doing. Regulations are also important to consider, so these include zoning and other legal considerations. What are your applicable local, state, and federal guidelines and regulations? And then you can also discuss this with your planning and zoning department.
Okay, I found this on the web. What are your local, state, and federal guidelines and regulations? Check it out.
Is that Siri?
We just had a little tech. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine, Jen.
So someone's Siri just popped up with the technology that we have, you know, on your phone.
Right.
So it just threw us off for like, we're like, what's going on here?
We heard it just very, very slightly. It sounded like a radio, so.
Thought I got disconnected. Okay.
You're good.
And then you need to consider your markets that are out there. So how are you going to sell your products? You can use direct marketing, so that's selling directly to the consumer. You can do retail sales or wholesale. And then even consider if you're going to have a farm stand or sell at the farmer's market. So these are all considerations. So Jen Jensen, you can move to the next slide. So as you develop your farm plan, consider sustainability, the land and its resources, your own social and community resources, your finances, and so forth. All of these components require balance that's unique to you and your area. So again, it's like things can kind of vary depending on what's happening with your own local farm and your own community. So next slide. So in terms of human resources, who is going to be involved with your farm and the labor involved? And what kind of skills can those volunteers or the family members or your partners help contribute? So this includes evaluating what you like to do, what your strengths, what your weaknesses are, or things that you'd rather have other people do. So looking at this holistically, it doesn't always have to be you that does everything. So are you going to, in terms of the financial sustainability of your farm, are you going to have somebody working off site? Are you going to work part-time? These are all considerations. Next slide, please. So this next slide is one way you can help evaluate yourself, like going through each of these different human resources on the left side. You can see, oh, I like to tinker, I like to do mechanical things. That's something that you could do. Or if you know that that's not your forte, how are you going to pay for that? Or do you have someone that you are partnering with that can do that? So this is a great way to kind of just go through your little checklist. Next slide, please. So other considerations are financial resources. So that's pretty self-explanatory to a degree, but it's what can you afford? What's your capital going into it? Do you need to take out some loans? What's your credit? And you can check your credit report at the annualcreditreport.com. It's listed on the slide. And then other resources include the Farm Service Agency, so that's the FSA. In our community, the Northwest Farm Credit Services is a great bank that works a lot with farmers and beginning farmers and ranchers. And they have a program called Ag Vision, and so you can look that up online. You can just do a Google search and find that. There's the NRCS, which is the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have a lot of resources out there. And they have an EQIP program. So you're entering the world of acronyms to a degree. It's EQIP. And there are a lot of resources out there. That stands for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And they provide financial and technical assistance to agriculture and forestry producers to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits such as improved water and air quality, conserved ground and surface water, reduce soil erosion and sedimentation, and improved or created wildlife habitat. One of the most well-known programs is their high tunnel hoop house program. Have any of you, I guess just within the local classes, it's important to know if there's anyone who wants to maybe get a high tunnel. They have a great program where you can purchase some approved high tunnels, and then you save the receipt and you can get reimbursed through this program, and you don't have to pay it back. So basically you pay it up front. You have to save the money to qualify. You pay for it, and then they will reimburse you. So it's a great program. And you can learn more. There's also assistance with cover crops and that so forth. So at lunch, we're having a resource panel, and in my local site in Driggs, I have some information about those programs. Next slide, please. So in terms of natural resources, there's land and topography, there's soil, what types of soil resources you have. So soil texture, plant vegetation, water resources. So this includes groundwater, irrigation, and so forth. Climatic considerations, like what's your plant hardiness zone, and so forth. Next, please. So a little bit more about soil. You often hear people speak about soil texture. So the texture is basically your soil type. It indicates the particle size such as sand, silt, and clay in the soil. And then there's 12 textural classes of soil. And the texture varies based on your geographic area and its geologic history. So this is something that's inherent with your own local site. And it's the hydrogeologic history that basically gives you that baseline of your soil texture. This is important because it affects the amount of air and water that your soil can hold. It also affects nutrient holding capacity and leaching, permeability, so the rate at which the water goes through the soil, soil workability, and the ability of plants to grow. So it's something that you often can't change on your site. Does that make sense? People often talk about structure, and that's another thing. Soil structure is something that you can influence, that every farmer can influence. So how much organic matter you may have is another consideration when you're considering your site, or even just evaluating your own farm that you may own already. The organic matter is that top layer at the top of on the soil. It's usually about that top 5%. And it consists of partially decomposed plant and animal matter. So it's mostly leaves, roots, and stems. And when you go out, you often see it, you can even look white as the plant matter is decomposing. You'll see that. So it's a storehouse for plant nutrients, and it encourages biological activity. So this is the food that the microbes living in the soil then consume. So the organic matter improves physical structure, it holds nutrients and water. It also improves all soil textures and pH issues. So I think as a farmer or even as a gardener, this is maintaining soil organic matter is the most important goal of soil management. I can't emphasize that enough. Like this is the key. In terms of pH, some crops like higher pHs or lower pHs. So do you need more alkaline or basic pH for that crop, or do you need more acidic? And you generally can't change the pH on your site too drastically in your area, since the soil texture largely influences your baseline pH. So in our community in Driggs, we have very alkaline soils. It's very basic. We therefore can't really grow blueberries very well. That's like one really concrete example. And so just determining what crops you might be able to grow is that consideration. And then consider vegetation resources. Like, do you have a really weedy site? Is your soil like a great place for weeds? Do you have maybe timberland? So even up in northern Idaho, there's more forested land on some of the properties. What's already there? And that's also going to influence your decision making and what you can do. So next slide, please. So speaking of soil, finding out what your soil is, your soil texture, and some of the nutrient levels and what type of how much organic matter you have is a really great first step. Our local extension offices can help you with that, and we can provide you resources to take samples to get your soil tested. And I recommend doing that with any new property. Or if you haven't done it in a while, it's neat to do it every few years and see if things have changed. If your management practices are influencing what's in the soil. So each local site can help you with that. Next slide. Another great tool is to go online, go to the USDA web soil survey. So we have the website listed on the bottom of this slide. And that's the link to go to. You can click on it. It says Start WSS. So click on that, and then you can actually put in your zip code. You can even put in your address, and it will show you the most recent soil data. It will give you a baseline of what your soil texture is. However, I have to say that it still doesn't replace doing your own soil test. Because, for instance, if you're going to farm in an area that has had development, and for a great example is like building a house, you're moving your soil all over the place. In some areas, you might have even imported soil and that sort of thing, and it won't give you that really site-specific, that local knowledge by just going to the web soil survey. It gives you a great idea of what's your baseline. So I know people who have maybe tried to do blueberries or huckleberries, for instance, and those crops like to have very acidic soils. And they're like, oh, I'll just put acidic soil, I'll import soil, and I'll just keep doing that. But over time, it's going to turn alkaline in our area because you're watering with hard water. We have very high pHs. It's almost like, it's like, good luck with that, because your plant will eventually maybe die. But it's fun experimentation nonetheless if you look at it in that viewpoint. Next slide, please. So when you're evaluating your site, water is key. You need to figure out how you're going to irrigate your crops, or if you're going to have crops that maybe don't need as much irrigation. So that's going to influence what your decisions are. So do you have surface water that you can access, or maybe you can build or construct a pond? There's also environmental regulations you have to consider when you do that, so that's another thing. What are your water rights? And where I live in Victor, and I'm on Trail Creek irrigation, and they turn that on seasonally. And I pay like a set annual amount, but I have pretty much unlimited water to a degree. But in years that we have drought or there's water shortages, it's the senior water holders that are actually going to be able to access that water. And there have been times, I know farmers that are down in the southern end of our valley, they've had their water turned off, their irrigation turned off, because that water they just have to watch it go down and go to the senior holders. And so they have to manage for that. So figuring out what your water rights is paramount. Do you have well water that you can maybe access? Are you going to need to drill a well? And what's your water capacity? Next slide, please. So in Teton Valley, so in the Driggs site, we become really versed in short season crop production or gardening. Find out what your growing season is. So you can look up what your first and your average first and last frost dates are. And you can also determine what your plant hardiness zone. So considered the standard measure of plant hardiness, the USDA plant hardiness zone map is based on the average annual minimum winter temperatures. So it helps determine what can survive in your climate. And it's a very general overview. But in Driggs, we're anywhere from zone 3B to 4B. And basically what that means is we have a very short growing season. It's not unheard of for us to have snow in June and that sort of thing. And then the early season frosts like come August. Like we've got a little window. Some of the sites that I've looked at say that in Driggs in particular, we have a 39-day growing season. Whoa! But with that, that's going to influence how you farm. Did someone say high tunnels, greenhouses? So there's that to consider. So this zone also doesn't, those plant hardiness zones don't measure single weather events either. So it's just an average based on your climate. So you can find that information on these sites that we've listed, and also look up NOAA on NOAA. So next slide. So there are other climatic considerations, and this also includes the amount of precipitation that you get. In Driggs, we get about 17 inches of rainfall a year, but we have a tremendous snowpack. And I think in Driggs alone, it's like it's 117 inches annually. When you get into the high country, you know, you hear our ski resorts like say 500 inches this year. So that snowpack is vital to agriculture in our local community. And when that snow starts to melt, that's when it starts to recharge our aquifers, and that actually gives us access and to the stream flow and to the irrigation that we have. So all of that's something to consider for each local site. Also consider what are your microclimates. Since we have such a short season in our area, microclimates are really important. Depending on where you're at, you can have a longer growing season. And you can create microclimates even based on other things on your property, like physical resources. You might have a warm concrete building, for instance, that you can put some of those plants that need a little bit warmer temperatures. You can put that adjacent to that area, and maybe some of that heat that radiant heat will come off of it. There's a lot of creative things you can do, and in terms of creating those microclimates. Do you live in an area where there's a valley and there's like warm air that comes down in a current? Or do you live down by the river here where it's just can get really bitter cold in the winters? Sometimes it's like the coldest part in our entire valley. And if you're gonna have perennial, like for instance, perennial apples, for instance, you might lose that plant if it gets too cold. So there's all of that to consider. Do you have enough sun on your property? I've run into this issue where neighbors on the south end of the property have a tree, and it grows up and it maybe turns into a huge giant cottonwood that shades your whole property. So how much can you grow there? There's the same things with wind. Do you live in an area where the wind's just howling and ripping through, or do you need to maybe consider getting some wind breaks? So all of that's important. Next.
Okay, thank you, Jen. This is Jennifer Jensen speaking from Sandpoint, and we're going to continue talking about buildings and season extension structures as you consider your physical resources. So what do you currently have for buildings, and are they currently being utilized to their fullest capacity? It's a good idea to think through future or current enterprise management factors that will influence your infrastructure development and needs on your property. So with livestock, you might consider your future stocking rates, herd size, access to water or other points. With crop production, you might consider if you will have animals on the crop fields at some point in time, or do you need to account for animal exclusion? Make sure that they're not getting on there. Other considerations such as irrigation, machinery access onto the crop fields, and then of course season extension, as Jen mentioned. All those are important to consider. If you have buildings on your structure, on your property already, what's the condition of those buildings, and what are the potential uses for them? Is it someplace to house equipment or animals or feed? What can it be used for? Do you have fencing, and what type do you have? Again, what's the condition or age of that fencing? Will it need to be repaired? And as we talk about mapping, you may consider if that fencing is really where you want it to be on your property. With equipment, what kind of equipment or tools, tractors do you have? Also think about irrigation, other mechanical devices that you might need. So with your physical resources, that leads into creating a map of your property. And every property owner should have a map, preferably one that you've traced from an original image. It's going to help you see the whole picture of your farm, and will help identify either the assets that you have or maybe some problem areas. Maybe you have some problem areas due to the soil that's there. It's a poor soil, or it's a weedy area. You can mark those out on this property map. It also allows you the option to look at different scenarios with your property. To obtain an image, an aerial image to start off with for your base map, there's lots of opportunities to find that. Of course, just going to Google Maps is one of them. Your county may have an online GIS map of the county, which will show your property lines. And depending on the different layers that they offer through their GIS map, you may be able to see some other things as well. Yes, the GIS department. So for instance, in Bonner County, we have the GIS department that through their website, through the county website, you can access their map. Oh, geospatial information systems, I believe. You may also utilize drone images. If you own a drone or have a friend, I know some farmers that have utilized those to create their farm maps. And then as Jen mentioned, through that web soil survey from the USDA NRCS department, it too offers you an aerial view of the property that you put in. So you might start off with a master plan where you obtain an image from one of those locations, and then from there marking out your property line, and then creating more of a master map that might not show all the details, just the ones that you are particularly interested in. So the master map or the base map will have the geographic features or the natural resources, as well as the fixed developments, those that are not easily moved. And then starting with a more blank and open map allows you to look at your property with more of an open mind. So you might think more creatively about future developments without specifically concentrating on the current physical resources that are there. You can then create the map, you can create a map over top of that that includes the existing developments with the present buildings, fences, etc. But then using your base map, you can just brainstorm ideas for all possible layouts that might be envisioned for your property. And you might include things, the fencing and where you might have a compost pile or a manure pile. You might also map out some of those, have some of those natural resources, weedy areas or a marshy area. Is there water coming through the property? Those things can be mapped out as well. And then you can evaluate each plan. You might have not just yourself, but your other farm partners involved in brainstorming on the property map. And as you evaluate each of those, you can take some of the best ideas from each plan and then incorporate them into your overall plan for your farm. And I would say take your time to let this plan emerge. Do not force an outcome with it. Just let that come, and over time things may change. You may opt to change how you lay out your farm. So again, with your whole farm planning document, this map within it is also something that may change over time. And you can merge that with your existing infrastructure. So just a quick example, you might look at your farm. This is just from the Google Maps. And depending on how you want to lay it out, this was drawn on a computer, but you could also just draw on hand some things. Maybe you have some fencing, which are these orange lines. Maybe you are considering putting a new high tunnel in that I've illustrated there with a yellow rectangle, and then you can work on it from there. And then over time, if you have been farming enough, this is the same property looking at just through the Google Maps several years later, and you can see how some things have changed. They have put a high tunnel about in that spot, but they've actually added more high tunnels to that property as well. To learn more about creating a farm map, these are some other resources. So Developing a Farm Map from University of California's publication, and then Rutgers University Extension also has one on how do I prepare a usable farm map, or usable map for my farm. When thinking about your physical resources, the buildings and such, you do need to think about some of the regulations. So planning and zoning, like Jen mentioned before, they may have regulations on what can be built and where it can be built on your property. There may be building codes in place. Other things to consider might be health regulations. So if you are considering putting in a well, for instance, making sure that that is regulated by the proper authorities in your area, or septic fields, for instance. Animal issues, nuisance laws are also things to consider. Idaho has a right to farm ordinance that basically it says the legislature finds that agricultural activities conducted on farmland in urbanizing areas are often subject to nuisance lawsuits, and that such suits encourage and sometimes even force the removal of agricultural uses. So this law, the intent is to prevent that from happening, to prevent the loss of agricultural land. There are also other things to think about. Your Food Safety Modernization Act, overall food safety on your farm may, considering that within your farm map may help you decide where you do end up storing your manure or your compost pile, to make sure that you are following some of the best practices there. And then we have a noxious weed law in Idaho where you are required to control your noxious weeds, and you can find a list of those either through the Idaho State Department of Agriculture, or the University of Idaho also has a publication on Idaho's noxious weeds. Other resources, we talked about labor being a resource. So if you have labor, you might have young children as shown in that picture there that might be helping out on your farm. They may be living with you, but if you do have to hire other labor in, perhaps you might consider housing for those individuals. Consider that in your farm plan map and with your overall physical resources, as well as byproducts. So the manure, maybe you have a composting. Are there other byproducts off your farm that either need to be stored somewhere or facilities that could you could utilize to create a marketable byproduct? And consider other liability and insurance issues as well. There are lots of community resources that can be accessed, and after the lunch today, your sites will probably be discussing some of your local community resources. Just a few in general here. The University of Idaho Extension, of course, is a resource for you. And as Jen mentioned, the Natural Resource Conservation Service can provide both some financial assistance as well as technical assistance. They are also usually working in coordination with soil and water conservation districts in each county that may be able to offer some help to you as well. There's the small business development centers throughout the state that can help you sort out some of the business end of your farm enterprises. The Farm Service Agency, FSA through the USDA, and then also, as Jen mentioned, your local banks. And with that, I will pass this back to Colette and stop sharing.